Well, hello students and welcome to the Week 9 lecture for LW305 for 2024. This week we're looking at strengthening law approaches that we're calling micro approaches. So when we're talking about micro approaches, we're talking about ways that the effectiveness or the impact of a law can be improved by taking action or implementing policies or strategies that act on a person-to-person basis or at an individual level to guide behavior of individuals. Many small changes can add up to be very big changes. So if you know what drives behavior in a specific individual or group of individuals, and you implement the right policies or strategies to change that behavior over time, then you might find you end up changing that behavior of that group or even of society in a way that you as a government or a regulator are trying to change behavior. I'm confident that the lecture today will expose you to a lot of ideas that you might not have had much time to study so far in your lives. Depending on your double degrees, you might be more familiar with some of the concepts that we discuss than other students. As always, draw from the lecture the information that is useful to you right now and note the information that might be useful to you in the future. By way of overview of the lecture, let's say, well, you have law. Law applies to everybody, but not everybody obeys the law. So why do some people obey the law and why do some people disobey the law? Are they good? Are they bad? Is it about good and bad? Is it about poverty? Is it about circumstances? Is it about they don't understand the law? Is it about some of the things we've been talking about with the PALS minimum standards framework? If there's a lot of non-compliance and you're a government or regulator, you might be asking the question, well, how do you motivate or encourage people to comply? You can't be everywhere unless perhaps you live in a strict police state, although even in strict authoritarian police states, people still disobey the law, don't they? Remember all of the curfew breaches a few years ago. There was a case in Solomon Islands of a young boy who breached there was a fake or test curfew, and he then got some massive punishment. I don't remember if it was overturned or not. So we know that even when the consensus is that it's a really good idea to obey the law, we know that people still don't always obey the law. And we also know that even when a law doesn't seem to have much of a purpose, a lot of people will still comply with the law. It might be late at night, but a driver still stops at the red light instead of driving straight through it, even though there's no traffic, even though there's no need to stop for safety, there's no pedestrians or anything. But it's then a habit. This obedience has now been driven in as just a standard of behavior. So why? Why? What's the reason? You're lawyers. What's the reason? Right? Does it have to do with people's beliefs about the legitimacy of the authority that made the law? For those who breach laws like curfews or go and drink, a case of beer and then get in their car and drive somewhere, do they think that those laws don't apply to them or that those substances don't affect them? Do they know that the law does apply to them but just think they can get away with it? Do they consider the consequence of everybody thinking the same way they do and having our roads filled with drunk drivers? What is guiding their moral decision making? A haze of alcohol. Are they thinking rationally? Or If they're really drunk and decide to go and buy more beer and continue the party and on they go, they're not making perhaps rational decisions. So then are we talking about and wondering about, well, what's driving their behavior in that moment? Is it anything rational or is it something irrational? And then how do you address the behavior or change the behavior of irrational people? Do you need to recruit those around them? Do you need to make, try to introduce a behavior in society so that if you're drunk and getting drunk and your friend who's meant to be driving and staying sober drinks also, you take his keys and give them to the man at the bar, or throw them away or something. Don't throw the keys away, probably. Might start a fight. But how do you then introduce behaviours that then ensure compliance? Because he's not going to drive home if he doesn't have keys. Maybe you've still got a whole bunch of drunk people. You've got a different behaviour you might want to address in society. But if it then becomes a behaviour that people steal the keys and don't return them when people are drunk, you might have effectively addressed the problem of drunk driving without the need for crashes, without the needs for people driving drunk, or even the need for punishing somebody for driving drunk. So there's lots of different ways we can look at these problems of making people comply with law, or supporting or encouraging them to value compliance with the law or with the rules. But there are a lot of different ways we can maybe achieve that compliance, which don't necessarily have to involve law or the strict applying or strictly applying law, such as in the form of punishments or fines or so on. If you've got a large population of people who've never been taught that you shouldn't just throw rubbish on the ground, well, you can't just make littering illegal and start handing out $100 fines to everybody who throws some rubbish on the ground. You can try that, but you'll probably have a riot on your hands, or just a lot of non-compliance still. So, and then maybe you start at schools and you teach children that littering is bad, and you encourage children to throw banana peels or a juice box on the floor in their kitchen at home and see how long it takes for mum to react or dad to react. And perhaps introduce this general understanding that there are consequences for this behaviour, both in the house and outside the house. So you might have the idea that if you have a fine for littering, you'll discourage it because there will be a strong deterrence effect, but that's only going to deter people at all if they know about the law. And so if you've never communicated to them what the law is, then you give them a fine, they're going to feel that the law is unjust and lacks legitimacy because it's unfair. And so you might still have a lot of problems with compliance. Or if there's no procedural justice to determine that they did in fact throw that paper. Was there an investigation? How thorough was the investigation? How transparent? How accountable was it? So we can look at this from a lot of different perspectives. Today, one perspective we're going to spend a lot of time on comes from psychology, and we'll talk about Kohlberg in the lecture today. There's also a reading from Kohlberg this week, and there's additional material on Moodle where I go through the readings and point out a few key things that might be even, specifically relevant from the readings, which I encourage you to review. We're also going to look at Evans's law reform checklist, which is referred to in the reading by Anita Jowett. And finally, we're going to look at some thoughts from a guy called Roscoe Pound, a philosopher and theorist, and what he thinks about the extent to which laws can change behaviour. I note also that theory has moved on a bit from some of the things that Pound says, and we actually have a bit more research and information about how people are motivated, and more evidence, empirical evidence, on whether the state can change culture or whether culture changes the state. or whether the state can change behaviour through law and activities of the state. Pound generally didn't think the state could change behaviour through law, but it turns out other studies in years since have demonstrated that the state can do that, depending on a whole range of factors. Also, it's worth noting on Moodle there's a link to material by Carol Gilligan as sort of a response to Kohlberg, and I won't go into details here, but I thoroughly recommend that to you, particularly, you know, if you're somebody who thinks that, well, Carol Gilligan's main response to Kohlberg is that his studies showed that women or little girls are morally inferior versions of little boys. Now, that's, as she argues, due to the structure of his study and the way it was done, and back in the 60s and 70s, and further research sort of suggested, and theorizing suggested, that perhaps there's a bit more to it than that. And so again, I'd thoroughly recommend that additional material to you. So without any further ado, let's get underway. Ask from your course guide. We're not going to spend much time on it here. You need to do the study guide. Have you ever broken a law? Have you? Ever? Any? You've never broken a law? Would you say that? Would you say that to a priest? Would you say that to your parents? Maybe you definitely would. You don't want your parents knowing. Maybe the priest, you feel the guilt of confession. Have you ever plagiarized? Have you ever pirated a video? Have you ever pirated a textbook? Never? Never, never? Most of you have probably broken the law in various ways at various points. Maybe a little bit of petty theft as a child, hopefully not as an adult. Maybe lying, other sorts of casual dishonesty that, given the circumstances, might have been a breach of the law. I've failed to return a library book I borrowed when I was 8 years old, called I Am David by Anne Holm. I've never returned it. It's up here on my shelf, and I never will. It's not because I don't identify as a person that steals books. It's that nearly 30 years has passed, and I rather suspect they don't want it back, and that most primary school children aren't at all interested in reading that book, and they probably replaced it by now. Anyway, I don't feel guilty enough to return it. So then what are the rational reasons for obeying? If you're smart, you think about things, why should you not drive a car while drunk? Why should you not litter? How do you identify with what laws or what norms you follow and when and who's around you? Are you more likely to be in a car with a drunken driver if you're with a group of your drunk friends and you are also drunk? Are you likely to get into a taxi when you've just seen the driver get in with a half-drunk bottle of whiskey? Maybe not, especially at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe you were drinking with him, and of course you are. When do we apply rationality? And is that the only way people make decisions about whether they comply with the law or not? You would think if everyone was a thinking, smart, rational person, they would make decisions that comply with the law. Surely that would be rational in all situations. Well, what if the law requires you to, fill out a certain form before you are issued a lifeboat, and you are on a sinking ship and you haven't filled out your form and you need to go to the back of the line? Well, if that was a law or regulation, I would think you would not be motivated by your desire to be a good citizen, to comply with the law always. You might be more motivated by the cost-benefit analysis. If I stay at the end of the line, I might die or not get in a lifeboat. If I just go and charge the lifeboats and jump in, I feel like I have a better chance of surviving a sinking ship. So, what drives your behavior in what situation? If you're wealthy and want for nothing, what would motivate you to steal bread? Probably not hunger, probably not poverty, perhaps a sense of entitlement. If you were starving or hungry, what would motivate you sufficiently to steal, to feed yourself? So by talking through all of that, we know that the reasons people might have for breaking laws aren't rational. And they're not necessarily about fundamental disagreement with the law. People aren't breaching curfew laws because they just fundamentally think that they're a bad thing. Plenty might be. But there's lots of people out there that sort of just caught out, or they were having a good conversation, or they thought they could get away with it, or something less sinister than outright disobedience. Yeah? It's convenient. My friends, it was peer pressure. I was ignorant of the law or the rules. I didn't know I couldn't fish here. I didn't know I couldn't take this type of fish in this season. I didn't know that this was a protected site. So, if what you're targeting here is, creating a law or reforming a law because you observe non-compliance, say a littering law, and you see lots of people littering, by simply saying, well, okay, there's going to be $100 fine, we're going to have security cameras, and we're going to throw all this money at just smashing people for littering, well, that might not be successful at stopping people littering. Because people tend to react badly to being treated like criminals, right? If you treat someone like they're an idiot, they will act towards you like an idiot. If you treat someone with respect and dignity, they are more likely to treat you with respect and dignity. If you treat the population as people who want to comply, but maybe they don't know what the law is, they don't know how to comply, for them it isn't convenient to comply, then as a regulator, a government, a litter agency, environmental protection authority, you might have a law which targets littering, and there might be a fine, but the practice might be that your focus is on communication and education. Your focus is on, look, if someone is caught littering, but then they pick it up, and the police officer has a conversation with them because they attended a training session and were equipped to provide a teaching moment to that person in society, or that person is encouraged to in turn, under the watchful gaze of the police officer, ask someone else, a child, a younger person, someone over whom perhaps they have seniority, to go and tell them to pick up rubbish or to not throw it on the ground. And maybe have that as a program supported by government, roll that out into different places, training sessions, seminars. Maybe people aren't convinced by just being told to do it because it's the law. Maybe they need to be taught the benefits of not littering, or for them, for their environment, and so on. So a lot of you in your group papers and a lot of you in your individual assignments may be thinking about issues like gender-based violence, about rape, about other crimes for which one of your options for fixing the problem will be increase the penalties. We want to increase the penalties to, mandatory life sentence. Well, that's good. That's maybe if sentences are too low and you have minimum sentences and it's you're treating it very seriously. But the people committing those crimes aren't more deterred by life in prison over 25 years or 20 years or 18 years in prison. That's not what's motivating them when they're raping somebody. That's not what's motivating them when they're raping a child. They're not thinking, I forgot, this is illegal, right? That's not what gets compliance. What might get compliance in that situation, i.e. a lack of sexual violence from a babysitter, an uncle, whatever it might be to not leave children alone and vulnerable with members of the family that might not be trustworthy, or just to make sure you always leave them in a group setting. No guarantee of protection there, I suppose, but that's something that isn't legal. It's just simply a strategy. Maybe you shouldn't have to have that sort of a strategy. Then there's education programs, there's men's violence programs, there's programs for enabling men to talk about the problems that they feel and feel they can't share, as the need to be a provider, the need to always be strong and never cry, all of that stuff. Maybe those sorts of programs are actually a really good accompaniment to strengthening laws on domestic violence, because perhaps studies show that these sorts of programs tend to reduce the incidence of violence, and by equipping men to better cope with feelings of anger or violence and react or respond in non-violent ways, perhaps we can start to address the core of the problem. Toxic masculinity, perhaps. So Kohlberg, it's quite a short paper, and it's probably a little bit hard for you to identify exactly how it links back to law reform. And these slides are an attempt to do that. I encourage you to watch this while also having a copy of that Kohlberg paper, and to pause it and to sort of read and compare a little bit and see if any of it makes sense. And if it doesn't, just forget about it. Just forget about it and move on. Okay. So, in a nutshell, Kohlberg says that people go through, throughout their lives, a process of moral development. And Kohlberg identifies that there are different stages to this, although these stages are interlinked, as is everything, and in different circumstances, what motivates people, and therefore how you change their behavior, how you encourage them to change their behavior, differs. But for the same thing, and we've got an example we will work through, you can come up with multiple different strategies which target different value systems around which people are basing their decisions. So take the example of seatbelts. Think of a law making it mandatory to wear seatbelts. It wasn't always the case. If you were going to make a law to get people to wear seatbelts, how would you ensure that everybody complies? What would you do to make that law work, to ensure that it's operating in practice? It's a good law. Seatbelts save lives. Seatbelts save children's lives. Seatbelts, are good. But a lot of people don't want to wear them. You know a lot of people that don't want to wear them, and maybe you don't want to wear them. Okay, so what are some of the reasons Kohlberg suggests that people might not, what does he suggest that motivates people? Well, the first is punishment and obedience. And you can think of a young child learning that, I don't like it when I'm punished, and mum and dad are powerful, elders are powerful, and I should just defer to what elders do, I should be respectful. Not in terms of respect of the moral order, that comes later. But initially a child doesn't really know much about society or culture or custom or whatever, what you first recognize is, I do this, I get punished. I do this, I don't get punished. And you keep testing those limits. So somebody who's, motivated by avoiding punishment, you might make it a crime. That might be one of your strategies, several strategies. You have many, many strategies that you want to apply and deploy simultaneously to make your law work, bring it into effect. So you make it a crime punishable by a fine or up to 6 months imprisonment. You didn't have a seatbelt on your child. That is child endangerment. That's an even bigger crime. Well, okay, but if you want to then rely on that one strategy, firstly we can imagine that working. Some people will comply because they just don't want to be punished. But you can imagine that's very hard to implement. You'd have to keep stopping cars and checking. You'd have to have roadblocks. You'd have to be enforcing it all the time. So that can only really just be one strategy. The best outcome would be everybody voluntarily complies with the law so that you don't have to, as a government or regulator, use more time and money and resources to make them comply or to try to force or compliance. The second approach Kohlberg identifies is called instrumentalist relativist orientation. And so this is a values approach that provides that right action consists of that which instrumentally, internally, satisfies one's own needs and occasionally the needs of others. Okay? So this is, basically, what's in it for me, right? This is, I will comply because there's some benefit I can get. What's an example? Well, a strategy for seatbelts might be to have registration stickers that are collectible or come with collectible cards or something that people want to keep. It's a pretty weird concept, I'll give you that. Or a social media competition showing seatbelts being worn. Win $50 with your best, seatbelts are safe, #snap. There might be different benefits or, disadvantages to these. You might do all of these. The social media campaign is cheap, right? Send out a few tweets, get a couple of $100 as prize money, and, try and manage it and build hype. Not a lot of people perhaps will want to show that they're wearing seatbelts, but maybe they do. Who knows? Maybe you get it on a radio station and cross-promote it there. Boom. Amplify that message. Maybe you get a radio host to do a segment on seatbelt safety. Maybe they invite some famous person on. Anyway, getting ahead of myself, purely under this heading, we're looking at people who are motivated by what's in it for me. And so if you, as a regulator or government, can come up with something that gives people something for complying, a reward of some sort, then perhaps they will more willingly or voluntarily comply. Then there are people that want to do a good thing, that want to please others, that want to feel accepted, and so on. So these are people, and we're all this person. We feel social pressure. We feel pressure based on our identity. I am, a white guy sitting in an office chair in Canberra in my house. You aren't. So your social pressures will be different to mine, and the situations in which those pressures might influence you to do or not do something are going to be different too. So then for a government or regulator, if you want people to do a certain behavior and not the one they're currently doing, the problem, how do you generate social pressure for them to change? How do you create, or one option, how do you make compliance cool? And one way of doing that might be to have celebrities or, local people, people who went to that school, who were a bad kid, who became a good kid and then became an international rugby star, all through being a good person who wore their seatbelt, or whatever the message you're going for is. Right? So how do those social pressures, if somebody from your village who is very important and famous is telling you, sitting you down and saying, well, I have encountered the same ethical or problems as you have in my life, and I don't know if I've made the best choices, but let me tell you how I dealt with this problem, and maybe you will also make the right choice, or an informed choice. What effect does that pressure have? And that last example crosses over with this one, authority, right? So you've got an elder in the example I gave. You've got somebody who's senior, whom you feel social pressure from, but also there's an element of law, there's custom, there's an obligation to listen, to obey, to comply. It's a different normative order. It could be a religious figure who you respect greatly. But generally, under this law and order orientation, what we're talking about is people that sort of think, well, what is right is doing your duty. It's being respectful to authority and, maintaining social harmony, peace and harmony. And we might see this reflected in the national values of certain countries in the region, maintaining social order and social harmony and prioritizing that. And that's very, that synthesizes very well with people who obey state laws and are, moral, upstanding citizens because they obey the law, because the law should be obeyed, because we need to maintain social order. So, continuing our example of seatbelts, somebody who likes to obey laws because they think it's a good thing to do, well, maybe if you explain to them that, seatbelts save lives. Here's the statistics and evidence on this, and so this is a good law, and this is the rule. Like, the government's made this rule, so this is the content. If you, explaining the law. If you don't wear a seatbelt and you're caught, it's a 3-point reduction off your license and a $100 fine. If there's a child in the car with no seatbelt, it's an instant loss of license, etc. People in this category, and again you can see overlaps perhaps with category 1, fearing punishment there, will obey the law, provided they know what the law is. The 5th category he has is the idea that an individual assesses what is right, what action is right, how to behave, in terms of general individual rights and standards which have been critically examined and agreed upon by the whole of society. Okay, so this is social contract theory. This is constitutionality. We agree, we voted, we have our differences of personal opinions and values, and as a result, we narrow towards rational considerations of social utility. Okay, so this is where rationality might be coming into it, saying, well, look, I guess when you think about it, we elected a government, the government sort of has taken a study on board, the government's developed a suite of laws around seatbelt safety, and it seems that it would be, rational to comply with this because the government is trying to preserve the social contract, trying to make society better in general, and we can, and thank you for educating me on the benefits of seatbelt safety. I will definitely comply with that because I'm a part of society and I'm motivated by, rationality. Again, overlaps between all of this. The article is a bit more nuanced perhaps, but it's also a bit more removed from a law reform focused. So perhaps then it's a bit less accessible. So, forgive some of the inaccessibility if there is any of what I'm saying. I think I'll finish this slide. The important point is that people are motivated by different things, and Kohlberg's article gives you all of these different things to look for in a group of people that you're trying to target with law reform or to improve compliance. Okay, so this final one, 6, is, an individual assesses what is right by a decision of conscience in accordance with self-chosen ethical principles, appealing to logical comprehensiveness, universality, and consistency. These principles are abstract and ethical. At heart, they're universal principles of justice, of the reciprocity and equality of human rights, and of respect for the dignity of human beings as individual persons. So again, giving the example of seatbelts, we're to convince this person, you need to appeal to their conscience, whatever that is. They will be more strongly tugged by an appeal to their conscience than an appeal to what is rational or an appeal to something else. So if you say, hey, this applies to everybody, and here you're trying to target changing that person's view so that they see wearing a seatbelt as the right thing to do as a person. And again, that seems a bit fuzzy and overlaps with some of the other theories, but they are interlinked. Okay, so the takeaway is there are different psychological motivations of behavior, and when you're developing law reform, it's pretty important to be aware, if you want your law reform to be effective, that you need to come up with strategies to strengthen that law, to implement that law, which are able to motivate people in the way that they are best motivated. So this is Evans's checklist. This is in your this is in your course guide readings. Evans identified 7 necessary conditions, he called, for the effective use of law as an independent social force to influence behavior and beliefs. So he says that, look, if you want your law reform to work, then the source of the new law must be authoritative and reputable. So if you're a newly coined military dictatorship and you start issuing decrees, maybe people don't find your laws to have much authority because they believe that your government is illegitimate or your governance is illegitimate. And there's various other things there. Secondly, the rationale for the new law is articulated in terms of legal as well as historical and cultural continuity and compatibility. So in explaining why you need the law to the population, to people, it's important to say, well, here is a problem. We have faced it for a long time, or it is a new problem. And this law is a way of addressing that. And here is how and why this law is compatible with our way of doing things, with our way as a society of solving problems like this that come up. And if you communicate that strongly to people, they might accept, they might be more likely to be influenced or open to the influence of behavioral change. Thirdly, pragmatic models for compliance are identified. So this is a necessary condition that, well, look, the law might say that you have to do something by, well, let's see. Pragmatic models for compliance. So in order to register your motor vehicle, you need to have it inspected. You need to have a valid insurance certificate. You need to have a valid driver's license. You need to go to the motor registry and the police station and all of these things. You need to have all of these documents. You need to have copies of these documents. You need to have affidavits and all sorts of stuff, it seems, to attest to the validity of those documents. So what happens in practice? Are all of those steps always followed? Or is there sort of a good enough approach sometimes that, look, your car's a bit stuffed, but I mean, yeah, it'll pass. You've got to get to work. You've got a family. You've got the vehicle is your life, whatever. There are variations in the performance of ways people comply that I discussed in detail in the chapter by in the article by Jean-Pierre Olivier de Sardin, dealing with practical norms. So, yeah, we have to accept there's variations in how people perform or demonstrate compliance. You know, somebody gets it in by 9 p.m, somebody gets it in by 9 a.m. Okay, what's the cutoff time? They still submitted the assignment, you know. We've got to be pragmatic. A relevant use of time is made to overcome potential resistance. Whenever you announce a new law, there will be change. We know people always will resist change. Some people, most people, for some period of time, some for a long time, some for less time. So when you undertake a law reform process, when you are suggesting that there is a new law to be implemented, there needs to be a plan for how you're going to overcome resistance. And you have to give that a reasonable amount of time. It might take years, it might take decades to educate a community, who knows? The enforcement agents, 5, are themselves committed to the behaviour required by law. So if the rule is no drinking kava on the job, and the police are all sitting around drinking kava on the job, how likely are they going to be to enforce laws around not drinking kava on the job? Unlikely. If fishing enforcement agents are corrupt, taking bribes, or themselves engaged in illegal fishing, well, that's not going to be a very effective law at influencing behaviour when the people see the government or the regulator also not complying. If nobody's complying, why would I comply? So Evans says this is a necessary condition. 6, positive as well as negative sanctions are employed to strengthen, buttress the law. So, as well as penalties for non-compliance, are there rewards for compliance? If you register your business on time, you get a discount on business registration. If you pay your tax bill on time, you get a discount, maybe. What are the incentives to comply? And he says, look, if you want law to work, it must both punish non-compliance and incentivize compliance. Effective protection 7 is provided for the rights of those persons who would suffer from the evasion or violation of the law. Okay, so you can make laws outlawing domestic violence. You can make criminal laws saying rape is a crime. But if you then provide no protection to the 40% of women who suffer, or more, 60 to 80% by other estimates, who suffer gender-based violence, then how are you going to effectively fix the problem of violence against women? You can't just make there be penalties. How are you going to prevent? How are you going to protect? If you're making laws on litter, how are you can outlaw non-compliance, but how are you going to encourage compliance? How are you going to make it easy to comply? How are you going to make it safe to comply? How are you going to make compliance seem like the easy option than non-compliance? Okay, so this checklist is something that you can hold up in your individual paper as a bit of a guideline, if you apply it, for explaining why your law reform strategy might be effective, or in identifying things that you can say will strengthen the law. So point 1, if there was a comprehensive and consultative law reform process, people might see that there was more procedural legitimacy in the creation of the law. If the law was voted on by acclamation, which you don't have numbers of, and evaded Parliament by abuse of a constitutional provision, people might not perceive the law as being authoritative and legitimate. Yeah. Depending on the issues you are dealing with. Point 6, having positive as well as negative sanctions might be important. If you're dealing with domestic violence or anything dealing with violence, thinking about how governments, to strengthen the law, the objective of the law, to achieve what the law needs to do, not just punish, but also protect. And so it's going to be a combination of different strategies that will produce an effective law. Slide 13 shows you a couple of study tasks which, with the learning you now have and reading the topic guide, you should be able to do. This is the sort of thing that could be an exam question. I don't know, but things like this come up all the time, and I'd expect you to be familiar with Kohlberg's theory, and I'd expect you to be familiar with Evans's checklist going into your exams. So maybe this sort of thing could be useful for you to do a practice run of. We're going to come now to Roscoe Pound. So again, we're talking about different reasons for compliance, different ways that scholars believe law can help people to comply, and we know it's well more than just law. Well, Roscoe Pound wrote on philosophy and law and social change, and he coined this term, which actually is false, but state ways cannot change folk ways. Now, what does that mean? Well, for our purposes, laws issued by the state can't change laws that are regulated within the community, that are created by the community, sustained in the community, and exist within the community, and regulate the conduct of the community. State law can't change that. State law can't change the way your Wontok system works. State law can't change the way, your customary arbitration or dispute resolution processes work. And that's contested because subsequent research suggests it's not true. But this is an idea that's helpful for thinking about the challenge. It's very hard for the state to change the way people think. It's very hard for the law to change the way both women and men in Vanuatu perceive the legitimacy of a man hitting his wife. Disturbing survey data which suggests that up to 80% of women think it's okay, or at least 60% of women believe it's okay that their partner hits them because they deserved it. So where those ideas are embedded and entrenched parts of culture, again, simply making it a law outlawing violence isn't going to help much, because the rationale for the perpetuation of that violence does not come from the law, it comes from something else. It comes from not state law, it comes from some other source of law, custom, or some other plural legal order. So he says there's different stages of legal development, and we're going to go through a few quotes, so let's just see if this makes sense as we get through it. Societies, he says, start off at one level are primitive. The religious order, the legal order, what is moral aren't differentiated. They're just, kinship is important. Law is about peace and harmony, but not about justice. Look, don't go fighting in the street. Don't go doing things which affect your neighbours. But, if your partner is bashing you, don't come crawling to me about it. Don't go running to the neighbours about it. That's private. That's your problem. You deal with your problems. Law exhorts, begs, persuades, rather than commands here. And these are just typologies. These are simplified categories that just try to sort of, for pound, explain the way that laws develop in society and different ideas become embedded with law. So stage 2 here is strict law. So there's an element of justice. Somebody has been injured, they can go and seek restitution. Compared with stage 1, I don't want to hear about it. There is a place you can go where somebody will hear about it, and they might even think about what is fair. There's formal rules which give certainty and uniformity. This sounds a lot like the justice system. It's inflexible, but what is right and wrong is very black letter, and what is right and wrong morally, helping that bystander, is separate. Stage 3 is where we would see the modern common law, where the rise of the courts of chancery and equity have brought in the idea that the harshness of the law must be mitigated. The harshness of strict rules of law must be softened by discretion to be lenient, to be stricter, to incorporate into decision making or judgment the values of society and the interests of fairness of outcome, not just fairness of procedure. So trying to ensure equity, not necessarily equality. Equity of outcome, not equality of outcome. And then he says there's this fourth stage where the system matures and stabilizes. You know, there might be some rules that are stricter than others, and you know, a narrowing of focus, and then we move forward into sort of a lawless state. Law in a state of flux. Law is changing, it's uncertain, and it's ready for reform. When men demand little of law, but enforcement of the ethical minimum, enforcement involves few difficulties. So when men demand little of law, but enforcement of the ethical minimum, enforcement encounters few difficulties. When they seek to develop upon law the whole burden of social contract, enforcement of law comes to involve many difficulties. Okay, so in the wake of ambitious social programs calling for more and more interference with every relation of life, dissatisfaction with law becomes universal. So what's he saying? Well, there's a problem with enforcement. That people generally don't like interference in their lives. There comes a point after 8 weeks of lockdown when people just want to go to the beach, you know? And if you apply that to other programs, don't stop littering campaigns, moderate your drinking campaigns, drunk driving campaigns, the effectiveness of programs trying to influence behavior drops over time as people become saturated by things telling them do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, and they switch off. And that's sort of what he's getting at here. The causes, he says, of non-enforcement of law. This is the non-enforcement of law. Why don't the police catch all of the criminals? Are complex in modern times. They grow out of over-ambitious plans to regulate every aspect of human action by law. They are involved in continual resort to law to supply the deficiencies of other agencies of social control. They spring from attempts to govern by means of a law things which in their nature do not admit of objective treatment and external coercion. Wow. So, firstly, non-enforcement of laws, why laws aren't enforced is complex, but basically, he says that the problem of enforcement stems from trying to control and enforce and regulate things which, using force, enforcement, using a method, force, enforcement, that is unlikely to change that particular behavior in a particular context. So thinking back to Kohlberg's theories, you might be dealing with a group of people that aren't motivated by not going to prison, that aren't motivated by money, that aren't motivated by the social good or whatever you think the social good is, They are motivated by their self-interest. And nothing you do will change behavior in that group, perhaps. By way of enforcement. And if you know that about the group, then you've already unlocked the key to changing their behavior. You know they're not motivated by that approach, but you know they might be motivated by other approaches, and that those are the ones you need to try. In a nutshell, law is voluntary, voluntaristic. It's a weird term. Law is a product of the will of the lawmaker. Whenever the lawmaker wills something she would like to see enforced upon her neighbour, she essays to make law freely. This has made enforcement of law a great problem. Okay? So it's a term of art saying essays to make law freely. That's really trying to say that whenever a regulator says this is what I want you to do, and apply that to everyone, to others, then he or she is seeking he attempts to make law freely. Essays is really, well, in this context, is an attempt or effort. He tries to make law freely, and that makes enforcement of law a great problem. I don't really understand that, actually. So these aren't my words. These are part of the inherited knowledge of LW305 passed through many lecturers. This slide is problematic for me. You can ignore it. I have looked at it before, rest assured, and it made, I thought, sense to me when I read it. But maybe go and find wherever Roscoe Pound's quote is there and see if the context helps you understand that. Or just forget about it. Let's move on. Okay, so what are the limitations of Pound's? Well, firstly, I don't understand it, so that's a pretty big limitation, I'd say. How do you identify facts to which the law applies? How do you identify duties which are morally important? Which duties do you obey? The way people infringe the law is subtle and has effects on the interests of different parties regarding that law. Legal machinery, organisations, police, institutions, courts don't always really seem very relevant to ways that humans interact. Most of the time, well, you're law students, you don't count. Most of your fellow students at USB spend little to no time at all thinking about the law when they go about their social or day-to-day lives. And another limitation of Pound's here is that it appeals to some good group of humans, some elected officials, some noble judges, to set the valid law in motion, to make it all work. And what if those people don't exist? Hence, he says, and this is pretty action-packed, hence it is not enough for the lawmaker to study the form of the rule and the abstract justice of its content. Think of this as poetry. He or she must study how far cases under the rule are susceptible of proof are provable. He must study how far, by means of his or her rule, they may set up a tangible legal duty capable of enforcement, objectively, by legal sanctions. The lawmaker must study and consider how far infringements of the rule will take on a shape, a definable shape which the law may deal with effectively. How do we recognize the behavior? How do we know that a murder has occurred? How do we know that a litter has occurred? He or she must study how far the legal machinery, laws, rules, institutions, and remedy is adapted to effect what he or she desires, to give effect to the law, to achieve the end, to fix the problem. Last and most of all, the lawmaker must study how to ensure that someone will have a motive for invoking the law, calling upon the law, to enforce the rule that protects them in the face of other opposing interests that are infringing the law, their rule, their order, their peace. In layman's terms, are offences provable? If you're going to suggest that a new penalty is required, how will it be proven? What is the, we might know the balance of we might know the standard of proof, but what are the elements of proof? And can you set up, for whatever that issue you're dealing with is, a tangible legal duty? Can you make people responsible? Is that even valid? Will it be enforceable? Who's going to enforce it? If you say everybody must wear a funny hat, well, you're going to need a ministry of funny hats to start enforcing the wearing of funny hats. Is it provable? What will be a clear infringement of it? Do you need any changes? Policemen wear funny hats. Do you need to make sure policemen no longer wear funny hats because funny hats are illegal? Or do you need to make an exemption for policemen because their funny hats are okay, but your funny hat isn't okay? What about lawyers with their funny wigs? Are funny wigs funny hats? What's the difference? And who will have a motive? Who is actually going to be suffering from the sight of funny hats? Perhaps somebody needs protection from funny hats. A more serious issue, again, we could come to violence. Are offences of domestic violence provable? What do you need to prove it? What evidence do you need? Is there a duty of care that needs to be established? The duty not to bash your wife. How do you enforce that? How is it enforced? How are you planning on it being enforced? How will those enforcing identify when domestic violence has occurred? How will the courts then operate to protect victims and survivors? How will the courts operate to restrict the capacity for harm of violent or potentially violent offenders? And who is going to be seeking to rely on the law? Will it be a survivor? Will it be a lawyer? Will it be government protection agencies? Will it be all of these? And in what circumstance? How do you give them access to the ability to invoke the law and obtain its benefit or protection? Study task 7 from your notes. You want to make seatbelt laws. Think about pounds. How would pounds' consideration, go through them and try and apply them. Read the article, read your topic notes. How would they affect your consideration? So you hopefully did this with Kohlberg earlier. What would you do if you were just applying it through pounds? Are you going to write whatever you're going to write differently? Write it down. How is it different? That might be a good idea. What about an issue regarding a very conservative Christian country in Pacifica voting to, making a law saying, yes, it is fully legal, there is marriage equality, away you go. What might arise? What problems might occur in, achieving that? Maybe the law goes through Parliament. Maybe. That'd be your first problem. But let's say the law got through. How do you strengthen the law? How do you implement the law? How do you enforce that? Is that going to instantly make government officials and all sorts of other people, churches, ministers and others, likely to comply or to support or view the law as valid? So think of pounds. Which one of those two do you think will be more effective? Obviously, it's implying one over the other. That's the end of the lecture. So thank you all for sticking it out. I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. And I look forward to seeing you back here next time. Bye-bye.